Hey guys, this is Calm. I'm going to do the third game of Mamedyarov in the FIDE World Rapid 2013. He's black against Denis Kismatulin, 2658, so strong Grandmaster. Time control is 15 minutes each, plus 10 seconds a move. Okay, so Denis plays d4, and knight f6 is played. I've been playing the Grunfeld as black. I don't think Mamedyarov plays it, but maybe he does, we'll see. Again, I haven't looked at these games, and I'm just looking because I kind of like Mamedyarov style as white, and I know he wins this tournament, so I'm just going to have a quick look through all the games, try and learn something from it. Maybe you can too. Okay, so d4, g6, so maybe we'll have a Grunfeld. Okay, so g3 is like a sideline, not particularly aggressive. It wouldn't surprise me if white is down 100 points. He's just looking for a very solid opening against, one of the top, super grandmasters over 2700. Just a way to kind of deviate from a huge amount of theory. So bishop g7, bishop g2, castles. Okay. d5 is an option here, but then after c takes, knight takes, which is kind of Grunfeldy, you have the white option of just playing e4, whereas in the Grunfeld normally, white would have this knight on c3, and then black's normal response would be to take on c3, and play against the pawn center then. Because white hasn't committed his knight to c3, this knight actually just has to go back, and this can make the black position a lot more cramped than normal, so I guess that's why just castles. Assuming he wants to play Grunfeld, which he might not. So knight c3. Okay, so d6 is played, so we're gonna likely have some kind of King's Indian. I personally don't play, nor have ever played the King's Indian, so I'm not a big expert on it. So I guess we'll see how it goes. One other option would be to play go for c5 lines instead of e5, which is more King's Indian-y. Which I might have a better grasp at, just because it can transpose into some kind of modern Benoni thing, which I've played before. But yeah, I mean, you can try and get into some kind of weird Slav with like c6 here, but I think just e4 and then d5 can never really be played because there's too many pieces just controlling that d5 square. So it does look that maybe this is the best option to go into as black, even if you don't have a huge body of theory for the King's Indian. Okay, so just normal moves, knight d7. The idea here is black usually breaks out with some kind of e5 push, also possible as a c5 push. So you can play knight c6 as well, but knight d7 is generally more often played, because in lines where you play e5, white can respond d5 and does quite often. This will just push this knight away if it's on c6, so having on d7 keeps it out of the way of that. And if white were then ever to play d5, c5 is a nice square to put this black knight on. So usually in the lines with knight d7, white kind of just keeps the pawn on d4 and allows trades as opposed to pushing, but we'll see. So knight b d7, castles, and e5 is played. h3, I mean, we're only 8 moves in, so I guess it's like a theory move. To me it doesn't make too much sense, because the idea of h3 is just to stop bishop g4 lines in future, or maybe knight g4, but I don't think that's so much of a threat immediately, to where we can't say a more normal move like bishop g5 or something along those lines. But it's not a bad move. It allows king h2 later on also, in case we get a lot of pressure on this h3 pawn. So this pawn is not particularly weak, and it does hold this square, so it can't be bad. It's just I guess I wouldn't expect it to be the most common theory move, just based on we haven't developed this bishop yet, so you know, why not bishop g5 or maybe e4 or something like that. Rook e8 is played. Black's just playing to, you know, put his pieces on better squares. It's just developing at the moment. It's a very easy play. And e4 is played now, so I don't understand why this move and not the move before. It could be that he wants to wait for black to commit his knight to the e-file before blocking it up. Maybe he thinks for this rook rather on f8, the black can play something like knight h5, or knight e8, and then play f5, and having this rook can then be good on this f8 square as opposed to e8 because we're pushing this f-pawn, increasing its scope that way. Maybe he thinks by delaying himself playing e4, that makes black's plan less likely, because without a pawn on e4, f5 doesn't break through as quickly because it's not attacking anything on e4. So I guess that could be a reason. I'm just trying to like make the reasons up in my head as I'm going along, over what seems most logical to me. Because when like I'm trying to learn, I see the most obvious moves, because they're obvious, like just normal developing moves. And then I see something like h3 played at such a high level, and because I'm not familiar with the theory, obviously it can be theory, but I'm trying to make sense of it, if you like. I think openings, in general, have a very high correlation with just playing sensible moves, in terms of getting your theory lines, so yeah. So rook e8, e4, and black now takes on d4. So I like this by black because we've put our rook on this file, and by taking we're opening it up, and we're also opening up this bishop by taking on d4. If we don't take, and white gets the chance to play something like d5, then this rook is not going to have open scope along this e-file, and this bishop is also going to be blocked in. So what would make sense against that plan after d5, although it does give this, you know, c5 square, which is nice for the black knight, a later turn plan for black is going to be basically switching his rook back to the f-file, moving his knight out of the way, and pushing f5 to try and break through that way, because otherwise his pieces are very limited in what they can do. King's Indian is basically black attacks on the king's side, and white grabs all the space on the queen's side. This line is less so because he's played like a fianchetto line, so it's less quick. And also black's attack is somewhat muted because white just have more pieces around his king to defend, like this bishop, as opposed to having it on, say, d3 or somewhere. But we're still seeing the same kind of idea, just in kind of a lesser state. So I like this capture. Knight takes d4. So a6 is played. I guess this is against knight b5, which doesn't seem like much of a threat immediately. A later plan with that can be like rook b8 and b5, because then after all the trades, assuming that we can also defend it one additional time, which we can via like knight move and bishop d7 or queen d7, then we can push b5, and the idea of that would be to remove this pawn's grip over this d5 square, which will give black more room to breathe in the centre. I don't particularly think it's a big issue at the moment because white already protects it via this bishop, this knight, and this pawn, so I don't see how it particularly helps there. But maybe it's just the case that black wants to wait a move and see what white's doing. But it's another one of these moves where I don't immediately see and understand why this move is played. Because knight b5 immediately doesn't really worry me if I'm black in this position. But okay. I would play something like, I mean, not knowing the theory, I would be thinking to play moves like knight c5. I might be a little bit worried about the immediate b4 grabbing space from white, but if I was worried about that and planned to play this anyway, why wouldn't I play, say, a5 to prevent that? I guess because then a3 and a later b4 push, when black can't trade and take this rook, means that that b4 move can come anyway. And if we're doing that, then we can't protect the b5 square at all. Whereas if we play a6, it's protected. Because we're not going to be able to protect this square in any other ways, because if we play c6, d6 becomes too weak. And when I say that, I mean we can't protect it with another pawn behind it. We're never going to be able to push it really, because so many of white's pieces are protecting it. That said, again, I'm not sure why a6 is like such a necessity this move. So rook e1's played, normal. Okay, so rook b8 is played, so I guess he's going for this b5 plan. And now knight c2 back is played. So the most normal, if I just switch colours just to demonstrate this, the most normal reason you do these knight c2 lines is, one, because you want to move your queen, because if I, say, play queen a4 here, just an example, black would then be able to play something like knight takes e4, and then this knight on d4 will be hanging due to this g7 bishop. And the reason you bring it back to c2 is because long term you want to reroute it via e3, and it's going to have even more pressure on this d5 square. I don't think white particularly needs it at the moment, but so it's probably more to free up his queen, but you know, long term we're thinking about this knight e3 probably to just control d5. We don't mind putting a piece on d5. I'm worried that black might push it away with c6 for the reasons I mentioned last move. d6 would become too weak, and black would be completely tied down to defending it and have no real counterplay. So knight c2 is played. We'll switch back to black. Knight e5. So it hits c4. And knight e3 is played, which protects c4. I think you could play b3 here. I don't think there's any real issue with like this knight moving and then knight takes c4 tricks, because then you could take on c4 and after the recapture bishop takes c3. I don't think that's an issue at the moment because of this extra piece, but given that we've mentioned that white might want to play this knight d5 move anyway, well, knight e3 move to like protect t5, I guess he just feels like it's the most natural move in the position, and he doesn't want to invest a poor move when he can put his major pieces in a better position. Is it major? I guess it's minor pieces, because it's still a piece, but it's not a rook or a queen. And okay, so b5 is played. So I'm getting more understanding of this a6 move now. Probably they're still following a theory line, and clearly this knight c2 rerouting plan via c2 e3 is normal by white. I say that because you already invested a move in a6 and rook b8 to push b5, and you can only do this if this knight moves. It's kind of like black already knew that white was going to do this, and his opening is based on that understanding. So knight c2, knight e5, knight e3, and b5 comes. So this is good because it's opening up this rook. It's getting rid of one of the pawns from this, you know, central control over d5. And captures, and now a3 is played. So I think black is doing fine in this position. This c1 bishop looks a bit awkward to me because it's trapped behind its own knight and a pawn. Like I said, when he played h3 earlier, why not bishop g5? We could have developed it then. Maybe there's a reason. But to me it looks awkward, and it looks like white is mainly playing over control of this d5 square, like that's his main trump in the position, whereas black's going for quick counterplay. And I like this idea because the normal King's Indian lines where you push f5 quickly don't seem to be as good when white is being chatted this bishop, because after pawn takes f5, this g2 bishop will become a lot better, because its diagonal is longer, because this pawn is no longer blocking it. So this makes more sense, fighting back on the queen side as opposed to going with that king side line. Future ideas for black I think might be like b4, because although it opens up this, rook on a1 for white, he would be trading off this b pawn for that a pawn, which opens up this rook. And then you have the situation where this b2 pawn is backwards and it's isolated, whereas black doesn't have any isolated pawns, so his pawns would be slightly better in the endgame. It's not anything critical now, especially since there's so much going on in the center. Like long term, I like the idea of like a b4 push rather from black, to gain some pressure on this b2 pawn and tie this bishop further down. Because I feel like if we don't do that, maybe white can play b4, and then he can develop this bishop to b2. This counteracts our bishop, develops this bishop from the kind of block position which I was talking about earlier. And it just seems like a logical plan to me. We've already invested moves in pushing this b pawn, why not push it more? Okay, but black goes for some knight fd7 move. So the options here are, well, firstly he's opening up this bishop, so now if we have something like b4, then we can play like this knight move, like b4 here, knight f3 check, white recaptures because otherwise he loses this rook, and then after the recapture, black has bishop takes c3, which picks up the knight, so we regain that piece, we sacked on f3, and we also fork the two rooks. So that's kind of like a cheap tactic, but generally speaking, the guys at these levels don't play for cheap tactics, even though it's a short game. So I would anticipate that this knight move is because we want this knight on either c5 or b6. b6 is awkward right now because knight takes b5 is possible, but it might be the option later on, because maybe he's rerouting this via b6 to c4, which would explain why not quick b4, because it wants this pawn here still to support this square. But we'll see. It's f4 from white. This makes a lot of sense to me because we're gaining space, we're pushing that knight to a more passive position. Unless it goes to c4, which it probably will do actually, even though it allows the doubling of black's pawns, it would again open up this rook, so white might not want to take on c4 if offered, which generally means it's going to be better than retreating. Its only real other square is c6, and maybe you can go from there to d4, which could be useful, but generally when your pieces are all on these back few ranks, bringing this one back as well does not particularly help your position in terms of fighting back against the gaining of space White's been doing here. Okay, so knight c4 was played. So I'm thinking white won't take here, because if he does, black recaptures, and then the pressure against this b2 pawn is here. It does have double pawns, but it can be supported via this knight b6 maybe. And also, if he just leaves this knight here, black's not really doing anything. If he takes knight 3, we get to develop our bishop, which is great because we've already said that's in a passive position. We're already defending b2. I mean, maybe you can think about knight takes a3, because if pawn recaptures, we have this bishop takes c3, so that's no good for white. So he has to recapture with the rook. And then after b4, pawn move b4, we would then be forking the rook and the knight via our pawn. So it's interesting, but do something like rook b3, pawn takes c3. We can trade rooks here, or we can not. But I don't know. That might be good because then you're playing something like you know, knight takes e3, rook takes e3, b4, rook b3, pawn takes knight. Then if you play rook takes rook, it gets complicated because black also has the option of then taking on b2 and threatening to queen, which is, you know, a big issue. So I'm not sure. We'll have to look at that later. I don't want to spend too much time calculating it, but it's interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not going to sit here and calculate it because I don't want the video to go on too long. I'm trying to aim for half an hour most of these videos. And I don't know how long the game is, so yeah. Knight c4. Okay, so queen c2 is played. Yeah, okay, so that's why not knight takes a2 a3 immediately, because it's white's move, obviously. So white plays queen c2, and that defends against this knight takes a3 threat, because if we play pawn takes, which we couldn't in the other option due to bishop takes c3, now white can just recapture with the queen. So that was a lot of calculation for no reason. Queen c2, knight c5 is played. Yeah, getting more into the position, moving, just developing our pieces. Makes sense. Rook b1 is played. So maybe he's going for this b4 push now. Black no longer has the option of this b4 push himself because c4 would hang. And if he trades first, then he has to worry about things like bishop takes c5, and then a really poor late game pawn structure. White would then also be able to just push e5, which would blunt out this bishop and open his own, which would be very good for white. So I can't imagine that black will go for that. He needs to do something with his bishop. It's still undeveloped, so I mean, there's a couple of things. Bishop d7 defends this pawn, but probably better is bishop a6 or bishop b7, because if he takes on b7, we can always take on e4, d4 rather. No, e4 is correct. Because it has a discovery on this knight on b5 via our rook. We're doing it via, you know, temping on white's pieces. Obviously we'd have to play knight takes e3 first, just to ensure it doesn't hang after bishop takes c4 because of queen takes c4. But yeah, I mean, bishop a6 is another option. Probably bishop b7 is better because this is a longer diagonal. We think he can't get away with taking on b5. If we play on bishop a6 and he just trades on c4, I mean, yeah, white probably won't do that, but if he did, then this bishop on a6 would still be blocked by black's own pawn, so bishop b7, probably the best. I don't like bishop e6 because of maybe f5, just pushing it away. Bishop d7, maybe we want d7 for the queen. So yeah, okay, so bishop e7 was played, and now b4 from white. I mean, the thing is here, after b4, I think black can take on c3. Although we don't want to give away this, like, strong dark square bishop, if we take on c3, we're hitting his rook, so white rather pretty much has to retake on c3, and then it means his black's moved again, so then we can take on e4. White's only going to have one defender via this bishop because this queen has moved to c3, this knight is gone because we took it. So I think then we can take on e4 again and just run a pawn. So b4 is kind of surprising to me because I don't see that we have the option to take on c5 because then our rook hangs, so there doesn't seem to be any benefit to that. So potentially I'm missing something, but I mean we'll just go on. We're 25 minutes already. Okay, bishop takes c3 was played, so yeah, just queen takes. Okay, so knight takes e4, which is what I said. But I don't really understand, because after bishop takes, bishop takes, so it's not like we can take on c4 twice and regain our pawn there, because this rook is under attack. So it looks to me like white's just lost a pawn. Bishop takes c4 was played. Okay, rook takes is played, and I said bishop takes e4, getting some on this rook. Actually, this does the same thing, because it's not that this rook is pinned because it's protected by the queen, but it's if they take on c4, we can actually recapture via the rook. Or even the pawn to make it pass, but probably the rook. And we basically just remain this pawn up. This bishop is like really big right now because although it's rubbish for most of the game, on b7, white having traded off his g2 bishop, now this diagonal is open and white is in no opposition against it. So I think black is in a really good position now, just up a pawn with a much superior bishop to this passive one we talked about earlier. Bishop e2 is played. I'd imagine black just plays knight takes, because obviously we don't want to be mated. And we're just going to have bishop against knight, where this knight is relatively tied up. We have control over the e-file. And we have this monster bishop on b7, big diagonal. This knight takes is played. Okay, so now knight g4 is played. I didn't really consider that, I was just looking at the immediate recaptures. So the idea of knight g4 is, I guess, that we have knight f6 check tricks. But at the same time, black doesn't have to move this rook because it's protected by the bishop. And we also have the option of just trading. So it's like, from white's perspective, he can recapture this now and regain the piece, or he can go for some tricks, which may or may not work. So let's think. So at the moment he's thinking, if black now plays knight a4 or knight c4, it's not going to matter that I've not recaptured this immediately. So you must think that via knight f6 check, he's going to regain this pawn on e4, which may be true. After knight a4, the queen has to move. But not immediately, because this knight f6 is intermediate. So maybe his idea... Oh, I don't know his idea. Oh no, okay. It's knight h6 check is maybe the idea. The idea of knight h6 check would be that the king can't go to this diagonal because of this queen, and after queen f8, queen h8 check can come, and this forces like king e7, and when you're threatening the trade of rooks after the bishop recaptures rook e1, could get quite awkward. I think he can just support via d5 or f5, but that may be his idea. I imagine at this stage they're probably down to less than 5 minutes each, so the tricks are kind of annoying. Maybe he thinks just a pawn down in a normal position where black's pieces are also better. It's better to go for these tricks as well. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so knight a4 was played. So Mamedyarov has looked at it and came to the same conclusion that I can, that you can move this knight away and get less well, not get less, but he's trying to force white to get less than just recapturing the piece in the position. It's knight e4, queen a1 is played, so that tells me that white looked to these knight h6 and knight f6 check tricks, which, as you'll have been able to hear, I couldn't quite work out in my head, and it seems like it's because they don't work. So queen a1 back is played, just keeping this longer threat. Now king f8 is played, and knight f6. So what he's trying to do is make black capture on e1, and then after the trade of rooks, he's going to be threatening rook e8 check, winning the queen. Winning the queen because, you know, the queen and the king are hit at the same time. So I'd imagine black just plays like rook e6, rook e7. No reason to play like d5 and give up this rook for the knight, just, yeah. Okay, so white trades this rook, and now knight d7 check is played. The idea is that after queen takes knight, which he has to play otherwise he loses the rook, queen h1 can come with check, and then after the king moves you can pick up this b8 rook. So that was kind of clever. Maybe rook e6 then wasn't the best, but then again rook e7 probably, like rook e7 in this position. If you had the exact same, well I guess you can't have the exact same line, but I was going to say when you look here, like after this, if we had a piece on e7 here, and we still had this pawn on f7, then queen h8 would be checkmate, but it couldn't actually turn out that way because we'd always have this pawn still on. We'd always have something that's moved out of the way onto e7, so e7 would be available basically. I think that's right. Well, basically, if we had the queen there as well after knight e7 check, you can just play queen takes, and then e7 is going to be a square that's available for the king, even though we're still given this rook. Rook e7 takes, so knight d7, he takes it. Probably it's the best move just to take it. There's no benefit, I think, in going like king e7 and giving the rook that way, because the queen's still going to be able to come in to check here. So just queen takes, check, king moves, check. So that is interesting. I guess he just feels he's too much material behind. Like, even if after he takes this rook, black has two pieces for this rook and two pawns. One pawn rather. And after say queen c6, which supports c7, this queen is out of the game. He's threatening this kind of mate in one thing, and there's nothing on this diagonal to really stop black penetrating. If he avoids the mate, you can still run into like queen h1 check lines where he picks up the rook, and it's just a big disaster for white. So he's just going for the check because he's trying to force a repetition somehow. But I think after king d8, just the queen's going to be able to block these checks. In which case you're like, why didn't I take that rook when I had the chance? So king d8 is played, queen f6, queen e7. Okay, and there's no more moves there, so yeah, I mean he can go for the check, but then we just block with the queen, and after queen back check, then you can play king c8, and we've retained all our material, and we're out of all the checks, so why it's nothing. Okay, so that's another win for Mamedyarov. That's good. So he's on 2.5 out of 3 now, I think. So let's just quickly go through with the engine. I'm not really going to worry about the opening too much. Okay, so let's look at database. So H3 is not the most common. By far the most common is E4, which you played next move. H3 is the second most common. Still played 3,000 times, but 13,000 is e4, which, as I said, it just makes more sense. I was also saying bishop g5, but I guess there's something wrong with that, given it's hardly ever played. 282 games. Maybe it's just the case that h6 immediately pushes the bishop away, like forces him into a trade, and it's better to establish the center first. So, okay, h3 being weird is not me missing something completely, it's just, it's not the most common move in the position. Still fine though, which I think is what I said. Rook e8, e4, takes. So a6, I think we established that it can make sense based on how the game is going to develop. But again, knight c5 is a more common move, and that, I think I mentioned that as well. So it's not that I'm, again, not thinking correctly. That said, you can see the percentages. This refers to the win rate. So 62.7% means that's white's results in the position. So if there's 55.5 for a6, means relative to this knight c5 move, black is doing better with this a6 move. You have to take into account sample size and things. Probably both are very similar in value, ultimately, but maybe that these knight c5 moves are just more well known, so white goes for like, or black goes for like a relatively lesser known variation, which just long term has the same ideas. I'm going to keep this up because it almost crashed when I closed it. Last turn is a6, rook e1, rook b8 is played, now knight c2. See with this knight c2, okay, so knight c2 is not in the most common moves. What this tells me is it's probably not the best move. It's only been played 6 times. The reason, so I talked about earlier, like the knight c2 to e3 to support this d5 pawn. I think I mentioned that white already had a very strong grip over this, so I wasn't sure why you weren't like doing something with the bishop or something like that. And also it allows black to go through with his plan, like this b5 move, which can't be played immediately because protect enough times, and also you have knight c6 forking the queen and the rook. So maybe it's just the case that this move isn't as good, and that's potentially the reason why white got a bit tied up later on. So knight c2, knight e5, knight e3, b5. The computer actually already likes this for black by a little bit, quarter of a pawn. And now a3 is played. Let's have a look here, see if this has been played. Okay, it's been played, but only in this game, so yeah. So I didn't like a3 here because it kind of allowed this b4 push, but he played it anyway, and the evaluation drops a bit. That said, it doesn't recommend my b4 move. It just recommends knight fd7, which is what actually was played in the game. So there must be some reason for it. I'll try and drag the engine in as well. Okay, so as you can see, it likes knight fd7 best. f4, knight c4. Yeah. Queen c2. So let's give white a random move. So I'm going to do a new variation here. I just want to check out what happens here. So apparently the best moves are like knight c5 and stuff, which is better. I just want to check if this tactic works. So yeah, rook takes a3, b4, rook b3, b takes c3. Okay, so rook takes b8. We don't have to worry about the takes b2 like I was mentioning, because we have both this rook still on the file and this bishop supporting b2. I was right in that it's still slightly better for black, but it's not nearly as big an issue because we've got this extra attacker. So after like rook takes b8 and knight takes would be the most likely response, and then black just has a small advantage. So that knight takes a3 tactic does work, it's just that there's better options for black on the board. So queen c2, knight c5, we're back to the game now. Rook b1, bishop b7, b4. Yeah, so I mentioned this before. What happens? Knight takes, bishop takes c3. Seem to just be losing a pawn. Actually, the computer was evaluating it as like much better for white relative to this. Now it's come to some kind of new understanding that actually it's not that bad. So we'll see why that is, I guess. Queen takes c3, knight takes c4, bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, bishop b2, knight takes b2. It does like knight g4, which is what was played. So it's interesting that it likes this giving of material, and it still recommends the move away of the knight for black as the best defense. Queen a1, still following the game now. It likes king f8, which is what was played. Interestingly, the evaluation is very close to equal. This means that despite the material, maybe white did miss something. And yeah, it looks like he did with this knight f6 move. He should have instead gone for queen h8 immediately with check. Then after king e7, queen f6, king d7. It looks like he can just come in here and start taking some pawns. So he's taking a pawn here. And the king's going to get a bit tied up. And yeah, he's going to win back a piece on e4, basically. So from here, the king is going to go to c8, because otherwise after c6, rook takes rook. And then you can trade here, and you can play this with check. And after this move, we can recapture here. Actually, knight c3 here falls. So okay, so you take here, and then you actually have your own fork here. And now we're back in the situation where it's even material. I'm not surprised that white missed that, just because of the lack of time in the position and so on. But it shows that by playing this knight g4, it just has like the right instincts about it. Whereas I think I would have just immediately recaptured on b2 earlier on. So yeah. I think that's sometimes where I might let myself down. I'm like, even though I'm down material, I still try and play moves quickly where I'm just recapturing the material. Maybe when I'm already in a worse position, I should actually be looking to complicate the game as much as possible, especially at low time controls. So that's where this knight g4 tactic might come in. And I'm not particularly sure that I'll have looked at that. So queen a1 back, king f8, knight f6 was played, which the computer thinks is a big error. And after anything, basically, as you remember, we couldn't quite get the lines to work, and it's just because black's winning. Goes for this check, but after the captures, and the check here, black just escapes. So I hope you liked that game. I'll come back to you with the fourth one at some point in time. Potentially this could be the first series I ever finish. You never know. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys next time.